Welcome to the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm Bryan.
And I'm Jim Reske.
We're gospel addicts because we believe the gospel of Jesus isn't just good news, it's the best news ever.
We're addicted to the gospel because it doesn't just start us out in the Christian life, it is the Christian life.
Join us as we look at the Bible through the lens of the gospel.
Thanks so much for listening.
Have there been any particular scientists that have surprised you by changing their minds about God?
Well, first and foremost, Albert Einstein came to a belief in God. I don't know that he became a Christian, but his story in the book is pretty interesting. In fact, I just want to read just parts of it because you'll see the same pattern of what we just described. Einstein always believed that the universe was eternal, and therefore there wasn't any need to be a creator or anything. So that was his belief. But as he was developing the theory of relativity, he began to realize something, that the universe was expanding. If it was expanding, he says, if you put it in reverse, it had a beginning. There was a big bang, that there was a beginning. And if there was a beginning, there was somebody that had to stand behind that beginning and set things in motion. And he recognized that would be God. And he continued to resist this idea. And then he heard about this Hubble telescope that had been made, and in 1929 he made a pilgrimage to Mount Wilson to look through Hubble's telescope for himself. What he saw was irrefutable. The observational evidence showed that the universe was indeed expanding as general relativity had predicted. With his cosmological constant now completely crushed by the weight of the evidence against it, Einstein could no longer support his wish for an eternal universe. He subsequently described the cosmological constant as the greatest blunder of my life, and he redirected his efforts to find the box top to the puzzle of life. Einstein said that he wanted to know how God created the world. I'm not interested in this or that phenomenon, in the spectrum of this or that element. I want to know God's thoughts. The rest are just details. So Einstein comes to believe in God. Like I said, I don't know that he became a Christian, but he changed his mind about atheism. I think one of my favorites that's in the book is a Dr. Paul Vitz. He was a psychologist who earned his PhD at Stanford, and he spent most of his life at NYU up in New York. And he was an atheist until his late 30s. And today he's considered an expert on what I call, and there's a section on this, the psychology of atheism. And what Vitz says is that atheists often develop their beliefs because of non-rational psychological reasons, not because of investigation of the evidence and coming to a sound, rational conclusion. So I think out of intellectual integrity, every atheist should ask themselves, how did I come to this conclusion about God? How did I come to the conclusion that he doesn't exist? Did I truly investigate and examine the evidence and then conclude there is no God? And of course, a perfect example of this, and maybe the most celebrated scientist in the world today, is Dr. Francis Collins. And he's pretty. He got his PhD in chemistry from Yale. Then he decided, for good measure, he'd get his MD at the University of North Carolina, and he has since taught chemistry at Yale and Michigan. And then you may remember he chaired the Human Genome Project and led 2,000 scientists who were sequencing the human genome. And then a number of years ago, when President Obama was in office, he appointed him the director of National Institute of Health. But he tells his story of moving from atheism to Christianity, and it's fascinating. And he was at the University of North Carolina doing his residency. And as a patient, he had this little old lady, and she was sweet and kind, and she had a strong faith in Jesus. And here she is talking to this famous atheist scientist and doctor about her faith, and he would just listen and smile. And he said, finally one day she said, Dr. Collins, you've been so sweet and kind to listen to me talk about my faith, but you never told me anything about your faith. Tell me what you believe. And Collins was absolutely floored by it. He didn't know what to say. He said, and finally he says, it dawned on me that as an atheist, I look at evidence in the sciences and come to conclusions. He said, but when it came to religion and the existence of God, he said, I realized I'd never looked at any evidence. And so he began a journey. He had a patient who was a minister who recommended some of C.S. Lewis's work. And finally, and I think what might have pulled him over the line, was he started reading the Bible. And I think he started with the book of John. And you know what? He became a Christian. And he said, I've concluded that most scientists today who are religious skeptics are just like I was. They've never looked at any evidence. And that's why Dallas Willard says the major problem so many skeptics he encounters, he calls it, they are guilty of irresponsible disbelief. Irresponsible disbelief. They choose to disbelieve in something without any significant commitment to examining the evidence. And another person that most of your listeners are probably aware of, and a very similar story, is what happened with Lee Strobel. That's how he came to Christ. His wife became a Christian. He thought she'd lost her mind. He decided, I'm going to study all this evidence and just show her and refute her belief. And as he read that and studied the evidence, he realized this is true, and he became a Christian.
Those are great stories. I had the privilege of meeting Lee Strobel when he was writing his book, The Case for Christ. He traveled down to Miami of Ohio, and one of the guys he interviewed was a good friend of mine, Dr. Yamauchi, who is an expert on the extra biblical evidence of Jesus, the outside the Bible evidence that Jesus really existed. And I had lunch with him. It was a great time.
That's cool.
Let's shift gears here. So, the theory, could you summarize what are some of the biggest problems with the theory of evolution?
Sure. That's a great question. I think it's an important question. In the book, as you'll recall, and there's a section called Evolution, a Theory in Crisis. You see, what's happened, Greg, in the last 10, 15 years, numerous scholars have come forth and expressed serious doubts about the theory. In fact, recently, 700 scientists, all of them with PhDs, have signed a declaration of scientific dissent from Darwinian evolution. 700. And I share that because if evolution was a fact, why would there be this type of dissent from so many brilliant scientists? In fact, in his lifetime, Darwin could give no proof that we had evolved into humans. That's why it was a theory. It's not a fact. It was a theory. And you've probably seen that illustration over the years where you have a chimpanzee on this end of it, and you kind of go down the line and you end up with a human being over all these years. And in that illustration, you see these what they call intermediate stages. And Darwin said he had no proof, but he believed that the fossil record would vindicate his theory. But it hadn't. In fact, David Ropp, very highly regarded paleontologist, and by the way, paleontology is the study of the fossil record. But Rob's a highly regarded paleontologist at the University of Chicago, and he's the curator of the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. And he said this: "We are now about 150 years after Darwin, and the knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. We now have 250,000 fossil species, but the situation hasn't changed much." He says, "We have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time." And then in the book, I quote a number of highly regarded scientists who say the very same thing. And probably the most significant one is Stephen Jay Gould, who's probably the most prominent paleontologist alive today. He's a professor at Harvard. He may have retired by now, but I haven't kept up with him. But he and many of his colleagues, they've abandoned Darwinism, because they say there is no evidence of natural selection in the fossil record. And so this to me is most significant, Greg. Darwin himself said, if natural selection could not be proven in the fossil record, then the theory of evolution is false.
Man, that is powerful. And you know, all these years later, with all the technology, all the developments we have, all the advanced technology we have, we still can't find those. We still can't find those things. It's yeah, that is great. Thanks for sharing that.
Yes.
Well, I'm shifting gears here. Talk about the problem atheists must deal with when they consider the fine tuning of the universe. I love this. You have a great essay on the fine tuning of the universe, and why is this a problem for atheists?
It's a big problem. It really is. First of all, let me just say this. I think the strongest evidence for the existence of God is the person of Christ. I have a whole section on that. That's the most powerful evidence, I think, that God is real, he's personal, the God that we put our faith in.
Amen to that.
But just behind that, I think, as far as evidence, is the fine-tuning of the universe. In fact, the very famous atheist Richard Dawkins acknowledges that the fine-tuning of the universe is the most troubling argument that atheists have to contend with. In fact, they don't really know how to contend with it. And so what is the fine-tuning? Well, astrophysicists today will tell you that there are 122, not 3, not 5, 122 variables that need to be lined in perfect precision, in order for the universe to come into existence and to continue to be in existence. One of the 122 variables, and it's pretty incredible, we don't really think about it, maybe many people may not even know about it, but the Earth is 93 million miles away from the sun. 93 million miles. If we were a few miles closer to the sun, we would burn up. We wouldn't exist. If we were a few miles further away from the sun, we'd freeze to death. And yet we're perfectly aligned with the sun, and we have been for all these years that human history has been around. And so it's a very powerful argument. And what's interesting and kind of almost ridiculous is to look at how atheists try to explain it, particularly atheist scientists try to explain it. A number of them think that maybe some kind of super intelligence is behind this. Maybe aliens of some type from some far off universe have come and put this into play. Most of them don't want to consider that this super intelligence is God. They just think it must be some kind of alien.
The funny thing about that one right there is, like, who created the alien then? So it drives me nuts that you turn the History Channel on and it's all about aliens creating the universe. Like, yeah. But nobody's like, well, who created those aliens then? They don't. That just pushes the problem farther down the road.
That's a great point. That's a great point. And so there you see the stubbornness in the lives of so many scientists who, when confronted with this evidence, they don't know how to deal with it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast. Feel free to contact us via email at gospeladdictpodcast@gmail.com.
Stay tuned for our next episode, and remember, on your worst days, you're never beyond the reach of God's grace, and on your best days, you're never beyond the need of God's grace.
See you next time.